Hello, my name is Owen McCarthy, and I've chosen to do my 20% passion project on celiac disease. Gluten-free, not just a diet. So what is celiac disease? Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, which means it's where the body's immune system attacks its own cells. It finds them foreign and tries to destroy them. And so celiac, the reaction is triggered by the ingestion of gluten, which is a protein found in wheat, rye, barley, and some other grains. And so when a person with celiac digests gluten, the body attacks the villi proteins, which are projections in the small intestine, which help to absorb nutrients. And so when those villi are damaged by the reaction from celiac disease, nutrients are unable to be absorbed. So before I get too into detail, I'd like to say why I'm doing this project. So that's my brother. His name is Lucas, and he has celiac disease. And I've always known that. I've went through my life saying, okay, he has celiac disease. He can't eat gluten, which is in wheat, I think. And so I've had lots of gluten-free food in my house, and I've never really known why. I don't know why it happens or what's the real scientific explanation for it. And so I wanted to learn more about that, and I wanted to help other people learn about that because people really don't know a lot about celiac disease. Usually when someone says that they can't eat gluten, they think one of two things. One, they have a gluten allergy, which it may seem similar to celiac disease, but it's pretty different. Usually there's not as many long-term adverse health effects, and it's not as sensitive to cross-contamination. So for celiac disease, very small trace amounts of gluten, like crumbs in a toaster or something like that, can cause a reaction. And the second thing that people think is, oh, they're on a gluten-free diet, which, oh, they're just trying to feel healthier about themselves, or they're trying out something new. And celiac disease is neither of those, so I wanted to help other people understand that. So in terms of symptoms for celiac disease, first of all, you can have the genes that are necessary for celiac disease to happen and not have celiac disease. There are certain genes that are passed down, they're hereditary, and there needs to be something like a trigger, an infection early in life that sort of sets it off. Why does this happen? The answer is we don't really know. There's no real scientific explanation for why this trigger is required. And so back to symptoms. For children, symptoms are usually digestive problems and nutrient deficiencies, because if you think about it, when you're a kid, you're growing, and so you need things like iron. Iron is in wheat, and so if you're not eating wheat, you might have something like an iron deficiency. For adults, adults have less nutrient deficiencies because they're fully grown, and they have things like joint pain, depression, anxiety, or headaches. In terms of treatment, as of right now, the only real treatment for celiac disease is to follow a strict gluten-free diet. There is no approved treatment that is just like a magic pill that you can take and suddenly you can eat wheat. There are, however, some experimental treatments in the works. So there's a temporary resistance pill, which may sound like a magic pill that you can take and eat gluten, but it's really not. It's more about cross-contamination. So if you're going to a restaurant and you're not sure if they're really that good about those trace amounts, that like maybe they cook food in the same oven, it could be used as temporary resistance, but it wouldn't allow you to eat, say, a grilled cheese sandwich. There's also a form of exposure treatment that is currently being undergone, where a patient is exposed to celiac, they're exposed to gluten, and in a safe environment where the body is able to realize, oh, okay, this is good, this is friendly, it's not something that I should try and hurt myself for digesting. So I mentioned earlier that celiac is passed down through certain genes, and these genes are called HLA genes. And these genes provide instruction for immune system proteins. So they tell immune system proteins what's foreign and what is not. So what they need to kill and what they can keep. And so they find those foreign cells and they display them to the rest of the immune system. They say, this right here, it's bad, kill it. And so how does this connect to celiac disease? So there are two specific HLA alleles or types of genes, HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8. Both of these are proven to be associated with celiac disease. And like I said earlier, you can have these genes and not necessarily have celiac disease. They're susceptibility genes. So you have this entire population of the United States, and then it's kind of hard to see, but there's this white circle. And those are the people that have HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8. And then this little circle right there is people with celiac disease. So again, there needs to be that trigger to set it off. And because celiac is an autoimmune disease, the later age that it's diagnosed, which means the later that it becomes active, the later that that trigger happens, or the later that you've been eating gluten without realizing, oh, I have celiac disease, the higher chance you have of developing another autoimmune disorder where the body attacks its own cells. And as you can see from this chart, as the age of diagnosis goes up, so does the chance of developing another autoimmune disorder. Just thought you might like to see some facts. And there is I have a list of associated disorders. So celiac is more prevalent in people who have these diseases. And the two that I'm going to focus on are autoimmune hepatitis and type 1 diabetes. So autoimmune hepatitis is an autoimmune response to the liver cells. So it finds those liver cells foreign and attacks them. And it can scar the liver, which in extreme cases can lead to liver failure, which can require a transplant. And 6 to 15% of people who have autoimmune hepatitis also have celiac disease. The other disease I'd like to talk about is type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune response to the pancreas cells. And the pancreas cells produce insulin, which is a compound that allows our body to absorb glucose, which we need to survive. It's one of the simple sugars. And so if the body can't absorb glucose, they're not getting those nutrients that they need. And a patient with type 1 diabetes needs regular insulin injections so that they can get that glucose. So when I first set out to do this project, I wanted to have something big at the end. I wanted to have something big to show for it. And I thought, like, oh, there's going to be tons of information about celiac disease. People probably know so much about it. And so I said, wow, great idea. I'm going to create an idea for an experimental medicine for celiac. Turns out people really don't know enough to really come up with that. It's again, I said, like, the reason that trigger happens, people don't really know. People don't really know what about ingesting gluten makes the body think that those villi proteins are bad. So I didn't achieve that goal. But my other goal was to educate myself and other people, which I feel that by being here right now, I have done. So I feel pretty proud of doing that. And to end this presentation on a slightly lighter note and to tie it back to my brother, so that picture at the beginning that I took, as soon as I took it, I was taking it to put in this presentation, and he takes my phone. He's like, give me your phone, give me your phone. I said, why? So he takes my phone, and he edits the picture a little bit, and as a little brother does, he does this. So that is my brother. These are the websites that I used for my presentation and sources. These are the images I used. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions? Yes.
What were the other autoimmune diseases that were prevalent? I could only see the two highlights.
Yes. I'll go back there. So there is Addison disease, arthritis, thyroiditis. Oops. Basically they're very complicated and long, and I don't really know what all of them are. But I just wanted to I wanted to focus on those so there's not so much words, so that you're focusing on my presentation rather than trying to read everything at once before I move on. Okay. I guess. Thank you again. I should disconnect to the AirPlay. 5 minutes of questions, huh? Thank you. I'm going to take this off.
So I'm Forrest,
I'm Adam Zivney.
and we decided to do our project on the neurology of reward and pleasure in the brain.
So since this was a broad topic to research, we decided to split into two different ideas. Mine including why do we crave sugar, and Forrest including how does music affect the brain.
Yeah, so like ever since I was in third grade, I've been playing the violin, and I noticed that some sounds and pitches when I play sound better than others, and I wanted to know why. Because I knew that in the brain there are some like parts in the brain that distinguish between consonant pitches and dissonant pitches, but I want to find out more about the chemicals in the brain that relate to that.
So I was interested in why and researching why do we crave sugar because ever since I was a little boy, my parents used to tell me that sugar was a slow-acting poison. So I wanted to figure out why do we like sugar so much if it can have so harmful side effects.
So part of what we're doing as like our goal is to educate ourselves and the community because music can have a lot of benefits while sugar can have a lot of risks.
So when we eat something sweet or listen to something like music, we get a feeling of pleasure. And this is caused by various neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, the happy hormone.
And dopamine is also another neurotransmitter that is in our brain when we listen to pleasurable music or when we eat good food, and good sugar. So how cravings work is once we eat something good, dopamine is triggered in the mind, telling us we want more of this. We want to listen more of this music or we want more of this food. So cravings can relate to music as well as food. So I just have a quote here from Valerie Salampour. So music and abstract stimulus can arouse feelings of euphoria and craving similar to tangible rewards that involve the striatal dopaminergic system. So tangible rewards here, as in food, drink, anything that makes us happy. A lot of people think that you can't get addicted to music, but music can induce those same places in the mind that food can as well.
So what is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that travels through neurons or nerve cells through junctions called synapse.
And when they travel from neuron to neuron through the synapse, a chain reaction occurs throughout the brain. And this movement of dopamine that goes around the brain gives us pleasure. And dopamine can also regulate the cerebral information flow. So a lot of the memory and information that's stored in our brains and how it can be accessible to certain places is actually caused by the movement of dopamine. So that regulates information in our brains as well. And balance in dopamine is also very important because if you have too much of dopamine, then you kind of have unnecessary neural movement. But then if you don't have a lot of dopamine, you have really uncoordinated response in the brain.
So cravings are activated when an area near the top of your brainstem called the ventral tegmental area releases dopamine. And so dopamine travels to different areas of the brain called pathways to cravings. And so unlike pathways to cravings, pleasure hotspots are temporarily activated and send information and are part of the reward system and send information back to the ventral tegmental area telling us to produce more dopamine.
So here we have like a diagram of some important parts of the brain. So the yellow is actually pathways, and then the hotspots are, the red is actually the hotspots in the brain. So we have the ventral tegmental area, which is like a primary generator of dopamine itself. So like a lot of that has to do with cravings because dopamine induces this craving thought that we want more. So that's actually like as a result of the ventral tegmental area secreting the dopamine.
So now I'll be talking about my presentation on why do we crave sugar. So I'll be touching upon topics like the evolutionary history cravings, how do we taste sugar, leptin, artificial sweeteners, and what happens when we have too much sugar or have a sugar overload. So in the past, our ancestors found it hard to find sweet products or food such as honey here, for instance. So our diets mainly consisted of roots and nuts. And this gave us enough energy to survive, hunt, and flee from danger. But when we ate small amounts of sugar-filled products like honey, it gave us lots of energy. And when we ate lots of it, it not only gave us enough energy, but also gave us fat to be, so we can use it for, so we can use energy for later. And this was helpful in instances like winter, when food was scarce and we didn't have much food around. Unfortunately, or actually our brain has evolved to crave sweet foods to obtain energy from these sweet products. And when we ate these sweet products, we got a feel of pleasure. So our brain was basically rewarding us for eating something sweet. Unfortunately, nowadays, sugar is mass-produced and easily accessible, so we don't have to do much to get it. So how do we taste the sugar? How does the signal get to our brain? Well, for that, we have taste receptors. So we have taste receptors for sour, salty, sweet, bitter, and umami. And for sugar, when we eat sugar, the sugar complex binds to a T1R group of receptors, which then send a signal to the brain telling us this is sweet and it tastes good. And so in order to regulate how much of the sugar we can eat, or how much we need, we have a hormone called leptin. And so when leptin is released from adipose tissue or white fat, it sends a signal to an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, telling us we're full or we've had enough energy. But when we eat sugar, sugar breaks down to two components, glucose and fructose. And when we have too much of this fructose in our blood, triglyceride levels elevate. Too much triglycerides? Well, leptin's not able to get the signal up to the brain, telling us that we're full. So we'll continue to eat sugar and crave for sweet foods. Unfortunately, this leads to overweight and then eventually resulting in obesity. And so, do any of you here know what artificial sweeteners are? All right. So artificial sweeteners are used in many of our products today, not only because they're cheap and easy to make and they're 100 times sweeter than sugar, but they're also non-caloric. So it sounds like a great deal. No calories, no weight gain. And so, but when we eat artificial sweeteners, our body is not able to acquire the energy that we get from refined sugar. And so our body starts to think that we're starving and that we need more. So our brain starts to amplify the cravings and the pleasure. And so we continue to eat more and crave more and get an amplified effect of pleasure. And so this actually contradicts the whole idea of artificial sweeteners. And this really results in overweight. So eating lots of sugar and craving and basically these effects lead to multiple side effects such as sugar addiction or constantly craving sugars. And so this leads to a severe condition called metabolic syndrome, which consists of multiple conditions, including abdominal obesity, which is accumulation of fat around the waist or hips, elevated triglycerides and blood sugar. So leptin's not able to get that signal up to the brain. High blood pressure. And so is there any hope? Can we do anything to stop from eating too much sugar? Well, now all of you must think, because fruits are sweet and have sugar in them, they must be unhealthy. But that's not true at all. Because let's take apples, for instance. They're high in fiber, and they satisfy us. So basically, we don't crave any more sugars or sweet foods.
So the next part of this presentation is how and why can pleasure relate to music. So I'll be talking about some specific chemicals and parts of the brain that relate to pleasure when we do listen to music. And I'll also talk about why we like to listen to certain types of music and why other types of music are not pleasurable for us. And music can also lessen stress in the brain. And I'll talk about some neurotransmitters that are related to that as well. So two of the most important neurotransmitters when in contact with music are dopamine and serotonin. So these are actually different things. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that regulates the craving, and it can give us euphoria, which is an extreme form of pleasure. And it also says since you heard this piece of music and it's very good, we want more of this. And then serotonin, on the other hand, regulates our mood and our behavior. So depending on what kind of music we like to listen, if it's like calm music, then we feel calm. If it's very dramatic music, we feel energetic. So serotonin regulates the mood in our brains. And we have an MRI picture here. The brain at rest, you can see not many areas of the brain are activated, but then when we're in contact with music, a lot of the neurotransmitters that are going around in the brain lights these places up, and we can see a lot of activation in these certain parts of the brain. So the most important part of the brain in audio reception is the primary auditory cortex. So this basically so when we listen to music, it goes in through our ear into cochlea. It goes to this cortex, and then what this does is it calculates if we like this music or if we don't. If it's very consonant music, meaning if you have like a music that has or a tone that has a very have a very even wavelength, such as here and here. These are all consonant intervals, and an interval is two notes played together. So when you combine them together, you have these even wavelengths. And then, but for dissonance, which is what we don't like to listen to, you can see these very rigid wavelines. So the primary auditory cortex actually takes in these wavelines and then calculates if it's what we like to listen or if we don't like to listen. And then based on that, it can activate certain parts of the brain that can relate to consonance or dissonance. So just getting more into consonance and dissonance. So we can see here, two notes played together, right? You have two individual notes that are very stable individually, and for consonants, when you combine them together, they're still very stable. But dissonance, when you have two individual notes that are very stable, but you combine them, they're actually very rigidly weighted. So like that's kind of the difference between consonance and dissonance. And when you have these very rigid wavelines going into the brain, what it actually does is the nerves in the primary auditory cortex, they fire at different times, and when you have that kind of inaccuracy, there's a lot of disjunction in the brain. But in consonance, when you have even wavelengths, and they go into the brain, a lot of the responses in the brain are actually accurately timed. And here's the example of consonants. What? Oh, there's no Wi-Fi. So here's a dissonance. So that's like what we don't like to hear, right? Sorry. Yeah, so just disconnected.
Let's continue.
Okay, so here's an image of the auditory cortex. So we have so this blue part is the primary auditory cortex. So you see different sections of pitch perceptions here. So that kind of means like from certain pitches that we listen to, we actually have different responses in the brain. So when we listen to dissonance, we have there's no dopamine that flows in the brain, but when we listen to consonance, these certain specifically organized parts of the primary auditory cortex percept that and drive these dopamine and serotonin and these other chemicals to circulate in the brain, giving us pleasure. So another very important neurotransmitter that's related to music is endogenous opioid peptides. So there's actually something in our brain called the glucocorticoids, and these are chemicals that induce stress. So what these endogenous opioid peptides do is when when they're in high levels, they actually lower the level of glucocorticoids. And when you have that, you actually have less stress. So music can regulate mood as well as stress. So I just kind of want to get into the specifics of the mathematics of music. So when you have two notes played at once, or a two-note interval ratio, you have you have consonance or dissonance, right? So X is the higher tone and Y is the lower tone. And we see here all the intervals in a scale. So you can see some are very complex ratios, while some are very simple ratios. The perfect fifth is a very simple ratio. The unison is a very simple ratio. But these complex ratios have been proven to actually be dissonant. So the simplicity of the interval ratio actually determines how consonant that interval is. So using that knowledge, I used chords in intervals that had a very simple ratio, meaning that they were very consonant, and we like to listen to those chords. And I used that to compose a piece of music. And I also use this graph, and you can see the y-axis just measures consonants, while you have different chords down here. So I just use these top tier consonant chords, and I tried to make a piece of music that induce pleasure in the brain and release certain neurotransmitters. Okay. So now, just tying everything back and relating this to evolution and dopamine. So the evolution of dopamine basically says that things that enhance our survival are actually related to dopamine and pleasure, because pleasure and cravings induces us to do more of this thing. So like eating sugar.
So we have evolved, or in the past, we evolved to crave sugar because it helped us to survive for long periods of time without eating food.
And for music, brain movement is very important, because dissonance can lead to inaccurate brain movement, while consonance and these certain neurotransmitters that are related to pleasure in music can make us feel calm, make us feel not stressed, and can synchronize these movements in our brain. So what dopamine has done has wired our brain in such a way to do these things that are beneficial to us. So staying healthy in our daily lives. So with music, as I said before, there are a lot of healthy neurotransmitters that go around in the brain when we do listen to music, and we can unwind from a stressful day. We can regulate our mood. If we want to be dramatic or calm. So health is a big part of music as well.
So how to prevent from overeating on too much sugar? Well, first, eat fruit. It satisfies you. You don't crave after that, and you still get the same effects of pleasure as you would from sugar. Eat regularly to avoid hunger. I mean, don't overeat to the point where you want to throw up, but don't feel starved. Don't eat too little, or you'll want to crave, or your body will start to want energy, and then it'll start to crave sugar and sweet foods.
So our reflection. So some of the things we found were difficult, but some were pretty easy. So what was difficult was, finding relevant information, because we had two topics that were linked together, but still had their differences, right? So putting them into a slides together and meld everything together to relate to this one topic was pretty difficult.
Another difficult thing to do was finding graphs, or graphs that portrayed information that was easy to read and concise.
And an easy thing was actually compiling the slides and all the information into the Google Slides, because we already did all our research, and just putting that into words was actually pretty easy. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Here's our sources. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Owen?
So you said like our brain likes constant doesn't like dissonance. So why do some people like certain types of music that other people don't?
Well, there are certain types of music, like, rap or classical, country. There are different types of music, but all those types of music, they use the same kind of chord progressions, and for all of us, we like the same intervals. We like the same kind, like the unison is is a chord that everyone enjoys. But there are different types of music that involve like complex things like rhythm, a lot of other things that don't really relate to pitch. So like that's kind of where you have different likings of different genres. Any other questions?
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time.
Where should I put this if I don't have a pocket? Should I just hold it? Okay. Yeah. So, hi everyone, my name's Ava DeAngelis, and the topic that I chose to do my 20% project on was baking. More specifically, the biology behind the perfect chocolate chip cookie. So the reason I was interested in doing this is because I've always really enjoyed baking, just cookies, birthday cakes, things like that. It's something that I just really enjoy and I'm interested in, so I wanted to see how the ingredients in a chocolate chip cookie recipe affect the taste and the appearance and the texture of a cookie. And I was also interested in seeing how personal preference and the type of taster that everyone is affects what they consider the perfect cookie. So the way I did that is I created an experiment taking a recipe and eliminating and switching out ingredients to see the effect they had on the chocolate chip cookie. I then brought in the 7 experiments I did and had the class evaluate them on the appearance, texture, and taste. So the recipe I used was the Nestle Toll House cookie recipe. It had flour, baking soda, salt, butter, granulated sugar, brown sugar, vanilla extract, eggs, and chocolate chips. And I also used baking powder as a substitute, so it's not specifically in the recipe. So now getting into the cookies in the actual experiment. The first cookie is just the cookie 1, the control, which is just following the recipe exactly as is, not eliminating or changing any ingredients. So my hypothesis was that this would be a regular cookie, it'd be sweet and soft, and so if on any other slides where it says my hypothesis is a regular cookie, that is just relating back to the control. And in reality, it ended up being exactly as I expected. It looked normal and it was soft, sweet, and chewy, which does make sense since it was just following the recipe exactly as is, and I'd practiced with the recipe before. The next one was cookie 2, no baking soda. So I eliminated baking soda, and my hypothesis was that it was going to be flat, but that there was going to be no taste change because baking soda isn't really known to add flavor to a cookie. It really just affects the appearance. And in reality, it actually ended up not being that flat. So that was something I was kind of surprised about because that is the main role of it. But the taste did remain the same. It was sweet and buttery. So the reason I expected it to be flat is because baking soda, when exposed to heat, it releases carbon dioxide, which is a leavening gas, and helps the cookie rise. Cookie 3, I had baking soda switched with baking powder. So I expected this to be a regular cookie similar to the control because since we're switching out one leavening ingredient for another, I thought this wouldn't really make that much of a difference since baking powder does pretty much the same job as baking soda. And in reality, I got that it was lumpy, which I don't really think has anything to do with the baking powder. I think that might have to do with the chocolate chips or something else, and that it was a little bit salty. So as I talked about before, baking powder also creates a leavening gas and helps the cookie rise, very similar to baking soda. So cookie 4 was no butter. This was probably the cookie that was least well received. So my hypothesis was that it was going to be small and dry, and that is what ended up happening. It was really small, globular, crumbly, and it was really dry and floury. So butter is a very important ingredient in cookies. It provides fat, it adds flavor without greasiness, but most importantly, it's a binding agent. Since there's no water, oil, milk, in cookies, butter and eggs are really the main binding ingredient that holds all the dry ingredients together. So without it, it was very crumbly. The batter didn't really stick together in one mass. So when creating the actual individual cookies, you really had to put in a lot of extra effort just to get everything to stick together. Cookie 5 had no vanilla. So I expected this to look like a regular cookie, but I thought it would be less sweet and flavorful since vanilla isn't liquid enough. There's not enough in it to act as a real binding agent, but it does add flavor. And in reality, it was a pretty regular, it was a little flat, but actually the flavor didn't really appear to change. All of my comments ended up saying it was soft and sweet, so that didn't have the effect. So really the only role of vanilla is to enhance the natural flavor, and it is a very well-known flavor, so I expected that when people ate the cookie, they might notice something was missing since it's in most chocolate chip cookies that you eat, but it didn't really actually have that effect. Cookie 6 is no brown sugar. So I thought this would be light, not much color since in the name it's brown sugar, and I thought that it would be a little bit less sweet, and in reality that was pretty similar to what happened. It was pale and dome-shaped, and I got bitter, which I was kind of surprised about, but it kind of makes sense because when you're eliminating one flavor that provides sweetness, some of the other flavors that it may have masked start to come out, so I think that's why. So brown sugar, it adds color and it enhances and adds flavor to the cookie. The last cookie I had was cookie 7, which was no eggs. And so my hypothesis was actually incorrect for this one. I thought it was going to be a regular cookie and not really have much of a taste change. I knew that eggs were a binding agent, but I thought that they weren't important enough. As long as there was butter, it really wouldn't make that much of a difference, when in reality I was very wrong. It was very dry, very crumbly. The cookies came out really small, and the batter was similar to the ones without butter. You really had to work to get everything to stick together, so it was just very dry. So eggs, they add fat and flavor, and they provide structure and keep the batter moist. So without that, we were missing some of the structure that the butter couldn't provide all of it, so it is necessary for both of them. So the favorite cookies, I had everybody vote on their favorite after looking at and trying all of them, and the favorites were cookie 1, cookie 2, cookie 5, and cookie 7. So the control, the one without baking soda, the one without vanilla, and the one without eggs. So the control makes sense. It's one that most people would expect to pick. And then cookie 2, no baking soda. Since it really didn't end up having that much effect on the cookie, I'm not really surprised that got picked either. Cookie 5 and cookie 7 were some of the ones that were surprising, since I thought vanilla would add flavor, and the one without eggs, while it was harder to make, it ended up being pretty dry. It still ended up being one of the favorites. So you can see in this graph, the blue represents cookie 1. 40% of people voted for that one. The red is cookie 2, 20%, yellow cookie 5, 26.7%, and the green cookie 7, 13.3%. And there's no orange, purple, or pink on the graph because no one voted for cookie 3, cookie 4, or cookie 6. So now getting into how this all ties into the perfect cookie. So what just in general can be changed when making cookies? Not necessarily for the perfect cookie, but just what qualifies as an acceptable cookie. And so I think you can remove baking soda and vanilla. Based on my experiment, these were two that were considered favorites and acted as viable options for cookies. They tasted sweet, they looked pretty normal. Switching baking soda to baking powder, while it wasn't considered a favorite, all of the notes said it looked normal, it tasted sweet. There was nothing really wrong with this, so I think this would definitely work as a cookie that you could make. What is necessary in a cookie? Sugar and flour are the main substance of a cookie. You need the sugar for the sweetness, and flour is the most prominent ingredient and really just adds the substance. As we saw with cookie 4, butter is also necessary in just tying everything together, keeping it moist, keeping it so it's not dry. The reason I have eggs on here is because cookie 7 ended up being a favorite. So while eggs are important in keeping the batter together and really holding it all together, it doesn't really affect the taste. And if you're willing to put the work in to getting all the batter to stick together and to make the individual cookies, with removing eggs from a recipe does still work. Some errors that I think I may have encountered while doing my experiments were I didn't actually experiment with the amounts of sugar and flour. I didn't eliminate them or cut them down in any way, so I don't really know how that might affect the actual cookie. I knew they were really important, so I didn't really play around with it. So if I was to expand on this, I would do that. I also didn't eliminate salt from any of the experiments, and some of the experiments where baking soda or baking powder and something that didn't affect the taste was removed, I did get comments saying they were salty, so that is something I would definitely have to experiment with. And then I also didn't measure out the amount of chocolate chips in each cookie, so that could have affected the taste if it was overpowering, and also the texture if it was lumpy or had an odd texture. So now getting into how to define the perfect cookie. It's important to remember that it's different for every person. Every person has a different taste and opinion on what they might consider the perfect cookie to be, and it also depends on previous exposure. If someone is very used to having their chocolate chip cookies be small and dry, they're going to like cookie 4 more than somebody who's very used to having them be soft and chewy. So that definitely does affect what they consider the perfect cookie. So now getting into the different types of tasters that there are. There are 3 different types of tasters: super tasters, which is 25% of people, average tasters, which is 50% of people, and non-tasters, which is 25% of people. So the way you can actually tell what kind of taster you are is there's this experiment where you take this little piece of paper and it has the chemical 6N-propyluracil on it, and this is a very bitter tasting chemical. So we actually did it in class, and the different taste that you taste when you put this paper on your mouth determines what kind of taster you are. So the first one is a super taster. So the chemical, which we'll call prop for short, they find prop disgusting. They put the paper in their mouth and it's very repulsive. They really want to wash their mouth out. It's something that they don't find pleasant at all. They really hate it. These people are usually pickier eaters. They have more taste buds, and they're very sensitive to strong flavors. So things like dark chocolate, broccoli, grapefruit, coffee, really spicy foods. They don't use a lot of seasoning, and they tend to use a lot of salt because salt helps mask flavor. The next type, it's not coming up now, but it's the average taster, which they taste the chemical prop, but it's just kind of unpleasant. It's not something that they find disgusting. They have to wash their mouth out. It's just not something they necessarily want to taste again. They are what we might consider normal. They eat a variety of foods. They can handle spices, just what we would consider a normal taster. And then the last one is not a non-taster. So they don't taste the chemical prop at all. It just isn't, when they put the paper in their mouth, it just tastes like paper. They usually like very spicy foods. They use a lot of seasoning. They're more likely to drink alcohol and to smoke just because those flavors aren't as serious to them. And the way this actually used to tie into evolution, still does but not as much, is that if a super taster were to eat a plant that was really toxic and really tasted really bad and might be dangerous to them, they would stop because they would taste this flavor and not want to eat anymore. Whereas if a non-taster were to eat the same plant, they wouldn't taste this really toxic, disgusting flavor, and that might end up hurting them. So lastly, just tying everything together is how these ingredients that I eliminated from my cookie create different types of cookies that different people, depending on their personal preference, their previous exposure, and what kind of taster they are, all tie into what they might consider the perfect cookie. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Do you know how Nestle decided on the perfect cookie, how they came up with their ingredients?
I don't know exactly. I mean, we can see through my experiment how each one is important and why they would put all of those in their recipe, but I don't know how they found like the exact measurements and everything. Yes.
Two questions. One, did you vary the time that you cooked the cookies, or is it all the same?
I did it all in the same day. Like I kept the oven on the whole time so that it wasn't like a different like humidity in the air any different times. I did it all at
Were they
once.
all like 9 minutes for each?
Yes, I did put them in the oven for the same
And
amount of
my other
time.
question is, even the ones that didn't taste good, were you able to find enough of your 9th grade peers to eat all of them?
Yes. Yes, it was one of the favorites.
This is interesting because it ties into the two other presentations around sugar and gluten, flour.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder, even though you didn't do no flour, what do you imagine would have happened if you either had less flour or no flour?
I think that removing flour, it would be like, I don't think it would be kind of the opposite of the one without butter. It wouldn't be as dry. It would be very liquidy because the main substance of it is gone. And also, I think it would produce less cookies just because now we're cutting out like just such a large ingredient.
Could have had them have the cookies while they're listening to listen and use them.
Yeah, see everything that happens. Okay. Hi. Just an apology in advance. I have a really sore throat, so I might cough through this. But I'm Leah Crowley, and my 20% project was on the importance of sports nutrition. So just a little overview. The reason I chose this topic was that as an athlete, I really understand how important it is to keep my body healthy so that I can perform at my highest. And so my main goal for this project was to hopefully inform the community about how important sports nutrition was. And as a final product, I actually ended up making a sort of like energy snack, which I'll give out at the end after explaining it. So there are many important ingredients when talking about sports nutrition. And the first is that I'm going to talk about is carbohydrates. So at some point in your life, you've probably looked at the label of something you're going to eat, wondering how many carbs were in it. But carbs is actually an extremely general term. Carbs refers to any sugars, starches, and fibers that provide energy for your body. The one that I'm going to focus on the most is glucose, and this is because glucose is the only carb that can circulate through your blood in order to get the energy that you need to all of your cells. So all carbohydrates, once absorbed into your body, are converted to glucose, and your body actually isn't able to do anything with starches and fibers until they're converted. And it is recommended that normally you have about 400 grams of glucose in your body at all times, but for athletes, this number is much higher, closer to about 800 grams, because as you work out, you're burning energy, so you need to constantly be replacing it. If you do not have enough glucose in your body, you could have a condition called hyperglycemia, and this is when, if there's not enough glucose in your body for your body to use, catabolic enzymes will actually take glucose out of the stores in your muscles in order to get energy, but this can result in a lower muscle mass, and so especially for athletes, this is not favorable because as an athlete, we work so hard to build up our muscles that we don't want them to be depleted. The next important nutrient I'm going to talk about is electrolytes. So electrolytes are dissolved minerals in your fluids in your body that are essential to keeping hydration and also to keep your fluids in your body regulated. So the 4 electrolytes I'm going to talk about are potassium, magnesium, sodium, and calcium. But first I'm going to talk about proteins. So proteins are essential for sports nutrition. They take about 17% of your body weight, and they're essential to they're in your blood, which help to allow them to clot. So if you get a cut or a scrape, you might notice that you scab, and this is because your blood clots, allowing it that you won't bleed out. Proteins also help regulate fluids in your body, and they're essential for cellular repair within your body. And so proteins start out as amino acids, and during protein synthesis, the amino acids actually link together and then fold in order to create proteins. One of the electrolytes that I'm going to talk about is sodium, which is found in salt. So salt is found in your blood, and it helps to absorb fluid through your blood. And you have to keep your sodium in your body regulated because too little sodium could result in low blood pressure, but too much could result in high blood pressure. But if you have just the right, then your blood pressure will be regulated. And because sodium is not actually stored in your body, it is essential to keep it as a part of your daily diet because it is so essential to absorbing fluids. And to keep a regulated amount of fluids, it's recommended that you take about 110 grams of sodium per 8 ounces of water. So in my energy bar, there's about 220 grams of sodium, which is why it is recommended that you drink about 16 ounces of fluids prior to working out. And it is also recommended that because of the amounts of sodium and other nutrients that you eat the energy bar about a half an hour to an hour before working out. Another electrolyte I'm going to talk about is calcium. So as parents, you've all probably told your kids, drink your milk, it's good for your bones. This is because milk is extremely rich in calcium. Calcium is stored in your bones and is essential for bone and muscle function. If your body does not have enough calcium, just how in glucose enzymes would remove the glucose from your muscles if you don't have enough, they would remove them from your bones if you don't have enough calcium. So because calcium is stored in your bones, it is directly related to bone density. And if you do not have enough, your bone density will decrease as calcium is removed from your bones. An extreme example of this is osteoporosis. So as you can see here, this would be an example of a regular bone structure, and then this would be a bone that has osteoporosis. So with osteoporosis, your bone density would be much less dense. And as an athlete, you don't want any form of this because, especially for contact sports, your bones are extremely important in being able to take a hit or give a hit without getting hurt. But if your bones were not dense, they would be extremely fragile, and any minor hit, even just like stubbing your toe for non-athletes, could result in a broken bone. And osteoporosis is normally found in older cases, but if any, even a minor depletion of calcium can result in a lower bone density, which could be not as serious as osteoporosis, but the same symptoms of fragile, less dense bones would still occur. Calcium is also essential to muscle function because calcium is present in proteins that allow your muscles to contract, which is any movement of your muscles. And so when your brain tells your body that a muscle needs to move, it immediately sends signals to your blood to grab calcium, which is found in your blood, and then bring it to the muscles.
And this is why if you do not have enough calcium in your blood, it would, instead of your brain sending signals to your blood, it would send signals to your bones, which is not favorable. Another important nutrient is iron, and iron is essential because it is important in making hemoglobin, which is found in your red blood cells. And it's a little hard to see, but so iron is found in your red blood cells, and then oxygen molecules will bind to the hemoglobin in the blood, and then this allows for oxygen to be transported throughout your whole body. And so if you do not have enough iron, you could suffer something called anemia, which not only results in a lower blood count, but the red blood cells that you actually do have would shrivel up, because without hemoglobin in your red blood cells, your body would not be able to transport oxygen, and therefore you would have less blood cells and you'd be severely lacking in oxygen. Iron is also essential because it is present in multiple proteins that benefit DNA synthesis. So premenopausal women tend to need more iron than men because during the menstrual cycle or periods, women usually lose about 1 gram of iron per day. And so while men wouldn't lose the iron, when women bleed, the iron comes out, and so you would need to replenish more iron as a woman. And for this reason, ideally, I would have liked to make 2 different energy bars, because some other ingredients that I'll be talking about would have different amounts, but unfortunately I could only make 1 version because my fridge broke last night, so we were keeping all of our food in a little cooler, so there wasn't enough room for 2 versions. So while iron is very essential, so is vitamin C, because without vitamin C, your body would not be able to absorb any iron, because vitamin C is present in antioxidants that allow your body to absorb iron. Vitamin C is also important in macrophages and killer T cells, which are 2 proteins that are first responders when a pathogen or something bad enters your body that your immune system would need to fight off. Vitamin C is also present in collagen, which is what keeps your skin looking young. So ladies, eat vitamin C to keep your skin looking nice. And while vitamin C is essential for absorbing iron, vitamin D is essential for absorbing calcium. And so when your body absorbs body absorbs vitamin D, it is immediately transported into a hormone called calcitriol. And calcitriol allows for your body to absorb calcium. And so without enough vitamin D, your body would not be able to absorb any calcium. And so even if you have enough calcium, if your vitamin D levels are not balanced with the calcium, you could still result in osteoporosis or a lower bone density, because your body, without being able to absorb that calcium, your body would still have to resort to going to your bones to get enough vitamin D. And because vitamin D is not naturally made in your body, and there are few foods that actually contain vitamin D, it is important to find other ways to absorb this vitamin D. And one good source is the sun. So your body absorbs about 50% of the vitamin D it is exposed to with the sun. But it is also important to remember, especially for athletes, that the ultraviolet rays you're exposed to from the sun are not good for you. So it is important to wear sunblock, because it's a common misconception that your body can't absorb the vitamin D with sunblock, and especially for athletes, if you're going to be exposed to large amounts of sun for, say, like a long run in the summer, you want to make sure to protect your skin. Another electrolyte is magnesium, and so magnesium is found in your blood, and it is essential for converting glycogen to glucose, and magnesium doesn't convert it alone, but it plays a key role. And so glycogen is a polysaccharide, which basically means a long chain of sugars. And when magnesium helps to convert it into glucose, which is a monosaccharide, so it's just a basic sugar. And your body cannot naturally deal with glycogen because it is so complex that it would take a lot of time to convert it directly to energy, which is why this conversion of glycogen to glucose is kind of like a middle step, because when there's glucose in your body, it can directly use it for energy. And magnesium is also present in over 800 enzymes, which are essential for muscle function, protein and DNA synthesis, and also for keeping your fluids balanced in your blood. So another electrolyte is potassium, and potassium is sort of similar to sodium as it helps with your blood flow, and so it's found in your blood. And while having too much sodium can result in high blood pressure, having too much potassium could result in low blood pressure. This is why if you have your potassium and your sodium levels balanced with the fluids in your blood, then your blood pressure will be balanced. And your body actually converts a lot of energy trying to keep your sodium and potassium levels balanced, because while potassium is found inside your cells, sodium is found outside of your cells in extracellular fluid. And of course, potassium wants to come out of your cells and sodium wants to get in using ATP, which is a form of energy. And this is why trying to keep these levels balanced uses a lot of energy. And when you run, one of the main reasons that you experience fatigue is because as you run, a lot of your potassium is converted outside of your cells, but the sodium does not enter your cells at the same speed that the potassium leaves it, which would cause an imbalance of fluids, which can lead to fatigue. And so the last nutrient I'm going to talk about is zinc. So zinc, like vitamin C, is present in macrophages and killer T cells, which help to fight off pathogens, but zinc is also essential in tear and repair. So when you work out, especially when you lift weights, your muscles experience micro tears, which, as they don't usually result in injuries, they do need to be healed. And so when these micro tears happen, zinc is the first responder to come to those micro tears to actually heal them. And one of the reasons that men tend to have more muscle mass than women is that zinc is extremely present in a hormone testosterone, which is more present in males. So when these micro tears happen, there's more zinc to come and heal the muscles, which means they can grow much faster, and this is why the men's muscles tend to grow faster, and it is easier for males to build up muscle mass. If you do not have enough zinc, you could experience sleep loss, because zinc is also present in the hormone melatonin, which allows for you to sleep. So without zinc, you would have trouble sleeping. While eating nutrients is extremely important, other key parts are drinking and sleeping. So staying hydrated is obviously important. It keeps your fluids balanced, which then directly translates to keeping your blood pressure balanced. It allows for better brain function. Water is about 70% of your body, and it surrounds all of your major tissues and organs, keeping them moist so that they don't rub together and chafe, which you wouldn't want your organs to chafe. And it actually helps your skin, keep your skin clearer. And so you've probably all heard about dehydration, but so dehydration can range from a dry mouth to dizziness and even passing out. So you obviously don't want to be dehydrated, but if you're experiencing anything from dry lips to dry mouth, it means you're already experiencing signs of dehydration, so you should drink water. And sleep is also essential because, especially for the micro tears I was talking about, as you work out and you're physically exerting yourself, your body is using a lot of energy, and it's actually experiencing micro tears all over your body. And so when you sleep, your body's not using any energy that it would normally use for brain function, breathing, muscle use, because your breathing slows, and as you're not moving, you don't need to use any energy for your muscles to move. So when you sleep, your body can use all of its energy to help repair any damages, especially if you're like me and you're sick. Sleeping can help to heal that. And then, so for my energy snack, I included dark chocolate chips, almonds, honey, peanut butter, raisins, wheat germ, and dehydrated milk. And this is because all of these ingredients contain 2 or more of the essential nutrients I talked about. Dark chocolate chips and dehydrated milk are rich in calcium. Salted almonds are rich in sodium, iron, and potassium. Honey is rich in glucose. Peanut butter has a lot of protein in it, so do raisins, and oats have a lot of iron and potassium in them. And while wheat germ is not exactly rich, I just used it to keep the snack a little less sticky, because when I first made it, they were pretty sticky. And then some other ingredients. Well, dried fruits, cashews, pumpkin and sunflower seeds, and chia seeds are not actually in my snack. These are all really good ingredients that have a lot of the nutrients I talked about. So if you were going to try to find an alternative, any of these would be recommended to eat prior or post-workout. So during my research, I discovered that men and women should have different amounts. And so this is how much of each ingredient is in the woman's snack. And so ideally, I would have made 4 bites. And so if you're doing a regular workout as a female, you would have 4 bites. But and then as a male, you would also have 4 bites, but the numbers are a little bit different. And then so the reasons that these amounts change is because, like I talked about, iron and also calcium and glucose levels would change depending on if you're a male or a woman or a female. So like at first I was just gonna do one bar, but then I decided to do 2 different because I wouldn't want the male bar to have too much iron or the female bar to have not enough iron, just for the benefit of the other. And then another essential thing to think about is that obviously anyone who has any allergies to peanuts or dairy or gluten should not eat this, as it contains all of these. And then also anyone who is pregnant or breastfeeding or has diabetes should be conscientious, because the amounts of calcium, iron, potassium, and glucose that someone who is breastfeeding or someone who has diabetes should consume on a daily basis would greatly differ than a regular and human. And all of the numbers that I showed before were based on the average males and females of about 30 to 60 years old. And then so throughout my project, originally I had wanted to make just 1 bar for everyone, but then I realized that male and females would need different amounts. And I also realized that depending on the type of workout, you maybe would not want to consume as much. For example, someone who was going to run a marathon might want to eat more than someone who was going to go for a light 1-mile jog, because obviously you would be using much more energy than if you were running a marathon than someone who was just going for a light jog. And then throughout my project, the things that worked pretty well for me were, I found there was a lot of information out there, and it seemed that a lot of people had already talked about this, and so the research seemed pretty easy, and creating and developing my slides were pretty easy. And everything worked, but some struggles I had along the way were developing my actual recipe. I had some struggles because I found that each ingredient, like my nuts and the dried milk and the honey, while it all contained important nutrients, the numbers would vary based on how much I wanted to put in my bar. And also memorizing the script was kind of hard. So my project, how it relates to biology, is that biology is the study of life, and so I talked about obviously like people and the immune system and how each ingredient actually affects the inner workings of the human. And thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Did you try out your bar before you worked out to see how?
I actually didn't, but no, I didn't. Anything else?
I don't know if you looked into this, but there's so many products that are powders and shakes and all kinds of things. Did you explore the difference between actually getting all of those nutrients from real food versus?
I actually did. So I found that a lot of the drinks and powders that you were talking about didn't actually have a lot of proteins in it, and those all focused more on electrolytes and glucose, but missed out on a lot like the potassium and the protein and the zinc you didn't really get from the powders. And also the difference between my snack and a lot of the ones that you could find at the store were that all of my ingredients are organic, and I didn't use chemicals to like hold it all together. So it's a lot healthier for you than some of the stuff that you could find at the store. you guys want to try it. First, is there anyone with a peanut allergy? Because these do contain a lot of peanuts. Okay. Does anyone want one? So there are
Okay, so my 20%, actually, warning beforehand, I have a few graphic images, so if anyone would like to leave, I guess now would be the time to do so. There's no blood or anything. So my 20% project was effects of war on a child, and I chose this because I've always had an interest in wars and how they play out, and I also know that there wasn't a lot of information that I'd heard of children after wars and what they went through, and I also really like studying about stress and mental disorders. So I had one essential question that I started with, which is, what are major mental and physical issues for a child after war? And this was the main focus throughout my presentation, but I also developed two more questions throughout my research, and one was, how does starvation affect a body's development? And how do the after-war effects on these children affect the next generation? So I wanted to focus mainly on World War II, because I've always had an interest in that war in particular. But when going throughout my research, I found that there wasn't a lot of information about the children in World War II, but rather their lives after. So I wanted to focus on a parallel, which I chose modern-day Syria, because there are a lot of commonalities that the children go through. So the effects and issues I wanted to focus on were mental health issues such as depression, PTSD, and anxiety, lack of development from starvation and undernutrition, and I wanted to focus on the kids who were targeted in the war for their race and religion and who were at the worst position during this war. So some of the challenges I had to consider were outside variables, such as family genetics that might make a child more likely to have a mental disorder, and then the exposure versus the issues they had. So if a child was in concentration camps versus a child who wasn't really a part of the war, how their issues may differ, and then finding patterns related to exposure and issues and the level of issues they had during compared to the level of exposure. However, I didn't find many patterns during my research, so that wasn't really a challenge for me. So the main point I wanted to focus on is issues found in later life. One of the main things I found in my research was in the inheritance of stress disorders, and I wanted to focus on this rather than finding information about how the children grew up and how their jobs were and how their education
So I changed my focus because I found more research on this. So there was a study of epigenetic changes in Holocaust survivors, and it was a study of 32 Jewish women and men, all who had different experiences throughout the Holocaust, and their 22 children. And they analyzed their genes, then they compared that to Jewish families that were not a part of the Holocaust and were usually in the US or in Canada, so who had no connection at all. And some of the findings were that there were changes in this part of a gene called FKBP5, which is a gene associated with stress hormones. And they found that there were changes in the particular part of this gene called intron 7. And they tested the methylation of, or when methyl groups are added to the DNA molecule of intron 7. And they found chemical tags attached to these areas of intron 7, but only in the group of Holocaust, not in the control. And the chemical tags, they turn genes on and off. So this stress-regulating hormone, this chemical tag would turn it on and off, sort of like a switch in a way. And so they both the kids and the parents had changes, but they were very different, as the Holocaust survivors had 10% higher methylation than the control, while their children had 7.7 lower methylation than the control. And this is evidence for epigenetic inheritance, which is basically a nature versus nurture, or how the body reacts to the environment, and the environment can change the genes to cope with environment factors, and this comes in the form of chemical tags. And so epigenetic is relating to or arising from non-genetic influences on gene expression. So this study, they looked at the sperm and eggs of these Holocaust survivors, and usually during fertilization, these chemical tags go away. But they found that this specific chemical tag on intron 7 did not go away, and they found this because the chemical tag on this gene was in the exact same place on the parents and the survivor, and the parents and the kids. They also found during this study that the survivors had low levels of cortisol and of an enzyme that breaks down cortisol called 11-beta-HSD2. And cortisol is a hormone that helps the body return to normal after trauma. So having low levels of this would make it harder for the Holocaust survivors for their body to kind of return to a state of normalness. And it also controls blood pressure, blood sugar, and metabolism, and it also reduces inflammation. So survivors, they had low levels of both, but their kids, they had low levels of cortisol, but they had high levels of this enzyme. So this enzyme is usually present in the placenta, and basically it keeps out the cortisol from the fetus. And having low levels of this enzyme in the placenta would allow for the cortisol to enter the fetus. And as a reaction to this, the fetus developed more of this enzyme to protect against the extra cortisol. And having low levels of cortisol and high levels of this enzyme, the kids would actually have more trouble protecting against starvation because of the high amounts of this enzyme. And so if like the survivors, they had low levels of the enzyme, it would allow for the cortisol to move more freely, which would allow for the liver and kidney to maximize storage of the glucose and metabolic functions and fuels. And this is a good response to starvation, as it allows for the body to kind of regulate nutrients and such to help with starvation. But since the kids, they had lower levels of this enzyme, it would be much harder for them to deal with starvation because they couldn't have this regulation throughout their body. And also, it would make them more vulnerable to PTSD and effects of stress. And they would also have age-related metabolic syndromes such as obesity, hypertension, and insulin resistance, which is also interesting because if they lived in with too much of food, then they would have trouble regulating that because they're more likely to get obesity and this stuff related to that. So if they don't have enough food, then they're in trouble, but if they have too much food, they're in trouble. So that was interesting. And then relating to this aspect of food, I wanted to focus on long-term undernutrition in children. So one of the first types of undernutrition in children is marasmus, which results in weight loss and dehydration. And you can see that in this picture, it kind of looks like the stomachs are going in. You can see their ribs, and it's almost like they're withering away. And usually this is preventable by breastfeeding. But as their parents of the children, they were also starving. They could not breastfeed their children. And this is an image of kids in Ukraine during World War II. And this is an example of another type of starvation called kwashiorkor. And this is from a lack of protein. And it causes the abdomens to swell up, and the body retains fluid. So you can see the abdomens are swollen. So kwashiorkor, it's from lack of protein. And in World War II, a lot of their diet was mainly carbohydrates, so starches and breads. And the effects of this are the body will break down fat to use as calories. But then the stomach will shrink, and this can lead to frequent diarrhea, which can lead to fatal dehydration. And then the heart will shrink next, and this can lead to heart failure. And then the lung capacity will decrease, and this can lead to lung failure. The body temperature will lower, the skin and hair will dry, and the immune system is impaired. And another long-term issue is that there can be long-term developmental issues with developmental skills because they can either slow or stop. So to meet nutrition needs, the body will break down these necessary tissues such as the heart, the stomach, the lungs to help fuel the body. So this can also lead to long-term effects. And then because I couldn't find a lot of information other than this undernutrition in the children, I wanted to focus on the children of Syria because there were a lot of commonalities. A lot of commonalities. So diseases, this child, it kind of at first looks like they have marasmus because of the flat stomach. But when looking at it, you can see that they have kwashiorkor because their abdomen, their rib cage is swollen. I don't know how much you can see, but their skin on their stomach is drying, and their hair is also dry. So that was many of the starvation diseases are very similar. And then many of the traumas they go through are very similar. They're bombed and they're taken from their homes, and that's another trauma. And then there are also many orphans in both World War II and Syria. And then some other commonalities are refugees. The refugees of Syria and World War II, they weren't wanted, so they're kind of being forced out of their homes and they have nowhere to go. And then also education. There's a lack of education in both World War II and Syria. So they'll have issues with jobs and education later in life. And so a lot of the refugees from Syria are in Lebanon, and there are 500,000 children refugees, and 4 out of 5 do not have education. And in total, 2.5 million children of Syria are not receiving any type of education. So here's a quote that actually a child of Syria said, "I feel like I've seen so many terrible things. We need to go back to school so we can study and get educated. What if I get old and I continue on this same path, and I lose out on my entire future? I want to study and grow up and teach my children as well. I want to be a teacher. What if all these years pass by and I don't become anything? It's not fair." So some of the results, that was one of them. Children will be undereducated. They'll have trouble getting jobs in the future. And then they found that 80% of people, not just children, are more aggressive, and that there's an increasing rate of mental health disorders. About 71% of children have symptoms of PTSD. And then 2/3 of children have lost a loved one, have lost their home, or have been injured from war. And then 48% of adults have seen children having issues speaking, which is part of that issues with developmental skills, which can be from starvation. And so future lives for serious children, this is kind of the overall message So one of my main questions at the end, which I developed a few days ago, was, will we find similar issues in serious children, such as this passing down of stress disorders? So that was kind of something to think about. And there is more mental health awareness in Syria, but it's still lacking. And then also in Syria, there's the UN is trying to get a lot of vaccinations out to the children. So this is kind of the difference in World War II. And then, so the overview, so I talked about epigenetic changes and how these stress disorders are passed down and how this can affect generations to come. Then undernutrition can deal with lack of development and have a great impact on the children's futures. And then serious children, I just spoke about and all the issues that they have in the future. And then, so what worked in my presentation and research? So I found a lot of connections to biology through the epigenetic changes and the starvation. And I was able to find a lot of information at the end. In the beginning, I was struggling, so I kind of changed my focus. And then what didn't work was I couldn't find any patterns because I changed my focus from that. And then I was planning to focus on the education and jobs that the children had later in their lives, but I couldn't find much information on that either. And then I didn't find much on mental health later in life. Again, lack of information. So these are my pictures or cited. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
On one of your slides, you say the methylation level for adults survival is like 10% higher than
Yeah.
and then the 7% lower for child.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No, that was one of the things I couldn't find. I was really trying to find that, but I couldn't. So I'm hoping that I will, but I haven't been able to so far. Sorry. Anything else? No? Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So decided to do my 20% project on how independent reading affects learning ability. So why did I choose to do this project? So I've always been a big reader ever since I first learned to read around 6 years old, and I always read a lot as much as I can and I tend to finish a book every 3 days and read 100 books every year. So it's always been something I've kind of been passionate about. So once we started talking about doing the 20% project and doing it on something that we cared about, it was one of the first things that popped into my head. So then I also wanted to do something in regards to the brain because we've done a lot in regards to biological things that have to do with systems in the body, like the immune system this year. But we haven't learned as much about the brain this year, so I was interested in learning more about that. So then I started I had to come up with a question, an essential question to answer. So I was I decided to choose this question, like how independent reading affects your ability to learn, because it's something that teachers have always told me, like ever since I was little, that independent reading like helps you with things like getting good grades and like helps you like do better in school, but they never exactly told me why and the exact science behind it. So I was curious about about this, and I decided to research this question. So what is independent reading? Independent reading is when you choose a book that you like want to read and are passionate about, and you just kind of read it for how much you desire and whenever you want, and you don't have to do something like look for something special like an assignment, and it's all like by choice. So when I first began research, I was looking at websites like Scholastic and blogs written by English teachers, and they all told me the same things my English teachers have been telling me for years, which is that independent reading helps with things like fluency and content knowledge and reading comprehension, and overall helps with achievement in school. So then I started actually looking into the science of things, and I first started looking at like brain development because I wanted to see how independent reading could like influence us. So I learned that the brain development, development in the brain, is heavily influenced by what you do in early ages. So things like learning certain phonetic sounds, like English or like other languages, are like firmly rooted in your brain, and this is why it's like harder to learn another language as you get older, because 90% of your brain matter is actually like your brain is at 90% of volume by 6 years old. So after I learned this, I decided to look into areas of the brain that were related to reading. So one of the first areas I identified is the inferior left parietal cortex. So I learned that the parietal cortex is a junction in the brain where it receives like visual stimuli from your outside environment, like things like word on a page or other things like that, and it kind of like processes all these things. So, and then I also learned that there's an area of the brain called the angular gyrus, which is in the parietal lobes, and this is like very important in like reading comprehension, and damage to this area can lead to like dyslexia and reading disorders, so it's pretty important. So then I learned about white matter tracts, which are like tracts in the brain that connect to different areas and lobes. So they are very important to like the signaling between different areas, and people who are stronger readers tend to have better signals and stronger signals flowing across these tracts, and weaker readers have weaker signals. So I learned that this is due to two processes called pruning and myelination. So pruning is when areas that are not used very much in the brain end up being got rid of or like getting weaker because they aren't necessary. And then myelination is when areas that are used a lot and get stronger and have stronger signals. So this is like important in independent reading because when you use the tracts associated with reading and the areas of the brain, they get stronger and you get better at things like fluency and reading comprehension. So after learning all this science, I decided to actually like see how this reflects on my like fellow classmates, because a lot of my research was like seeing in development in early ages, and like I also wanted to see how this reflects on adolescents, since they're still measured in their achievement levels by like grades. So I sent out a survey to the entire upper school, which consists of about 500 students, and I received around like 100 responses, which is like 1/5 of the people. So each percentage in my survey accounts for one person. So first I asked everyone how old they were, and as you can see, most of the participants ranged from the areas of 14 to 18, which is pretty typical of the WA upper school. So then I decided to ask them if they thought that reading was a very important skill, and 78% of the people did think it was a very important skill that people needed to know. And then I asked them if independent reading is important to reading development, and again the majority of people did think this. So clearly people have been educated in the same way I have since childhood, that these skills are important and must be practiced. But then after asking people if they consider themselves readers, the majority of people, which is 53%, actually said no. But if they asked if they had ever considered themselves readers like when they were younger, 77% of people said that they were. So 60% of the people who told me that now they don't consider themselves readers actually said that they did when they were younger. And this is due to things like lack of motivation or time or more work or stress. And these things end up being detrimental to the student's ability to do independent reading. So then I asked them how long they spend reading each week. So the recommended time reading each week is actually 2 hours. But as you can see, like only 10% of the people actually do this, with 12% of people actually reading more than 2 hours a week, which is very good. But the majority of people actually only read 1 hour, which is still better than nothing. And then what comes in second place, surprisingly, in percentages, is people saying that they don't read at all. So this is actually kind of shocking and disappointing because it's a very important skill to your learning ability and to obtaining better processing for the rest of your life. So then I decided to ask people what their grades were, averages, in 4 core academic subjects, which consisted of history, math, science, and English. So 70% of the people who have straight A's, meaning anything like an A-, an A, or an A+ in all 4 of these surveyed classes, actually say that they do spend time reading, and they tend to read at least an hour or more each week. But in comparison, 77% of the people who don't score any A's, which means a B+ or lower in every class, actually don't spend much time reading each week and don't consider themselves readers, and they tend to read less than 20 minutes each week. So clearly it's very important in achievement and obtaining better grades. So people do actually think the same to me, that students are reading less than they used to. And they also, a lot of people, the majority of people, 68%, do consider this a problem in society. But there isn't really much done to change this, because schools are actually cutting down on time given to students to read, and instead devoting time to things like vocabulary and writing, which are also very important, but independent reading helps establish a strong foundation to also help with these skills, and that must be established first in order to have better writing and better vocabulary. So what can we do to help? So I mean, my elementary school, and I'm sure as can be seen by the study, and others also taught that independent reading is important, and a lot of students seem to think this. But I think there isn't as much emphasis being put on this in secondary education, even though our school does stress on it. I know a lot of other schools cut down on the time, and according to my research. And so what must be done is that there has to be more stress put on it as students get older, and so they're given more time and are able to practice this in order to have higher achievement and processing and better grades across the board. So I believe we need to do this in order to help. So my reflection. So I think my survey was a very good and concise survey, and a lot of people told me in the anything you'd like to in the comments section I put at the end that they thought it was very nicely written and easy to understand. I think I could have maybe researched more in depth into the brain, because it's a very complicated and vast subject, and unfortunately I wasn't able to do as much as I'd have liked to do in it. But I think if I had more time, I'd like to look more into the brain, and I also maybe would have liked to contact experts who have done studies in this field before, because they would have been a unique source to hear their opinions. So these are my sources and my pictures. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
Aside from what other people have told you, how do you think reading has impacted you so much?
Well, personally, I think reading really helps with stress levels, because if I can get into a good story, I read on the bus each morning, which is about 30 minutes, so it really helps with making me feel less tired and ready for the start of the school day. So, and I think it it's really made me a better writer, and like communication is like really important and like something that's stressed upon in this school. So like I think reading a lot of like content has really helped me like with that. Yeah.
Could also reading like different stories help people's creativity?
Well, I didn't really look into creativity as much, but yeah, I think like reading about different things can help spark inspiration in people. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention and time. If you have any comments on how to make this process better, please write that on the comment form as well. You are all invited back tomorrow and Wednesday, if you'd like, to see some of the other presentations. So that's it for tonight. I appreciate